My education is aimed at my career. I only need the skills I need to be a plumber. It's a really different definition of education that we're seeing happen here. The Fed said the way it works is you have to use the standards, and then you have assessments. Now, you can join a consortium, but if you have your own state assessments, you have to send them to the federal government for approval before you can use them. So the feds control the standards, and the feds control the assessment. And what you hear is, these are just standards. This isn't curriculum. This is just standards. Yeah. Standards without attached curriculum aren't worth the paper that they're written on. And if I control what you're supposed to teach, and I control how you're going to test it, and your job depends on you passing that test, you're going to teach it? Of course you are. Of course you are. It's like, the standard is you have to make a chocolate cake that tastes just like my chocolate cake and has the same texture as my chocolate cake. See, my cake's lovely. 3 layers, sprinkles, it's great. I make great cake. The assessment is, I'm coming to taste your cake. And it has to taste just like mine. How many recipes can there be? 1. Because if you change anything, it won't taste like my cake anymore. Well, if we have central control of the standards and central control of the assessments, then don't we have central control of the curriculum? Yes. Well, of course we do. And I hear that from teachers all over the country. That, yeah, I'm going to close my door and do what they tell me, because otherwise I won't keep my job. When you think about it, think about your kids in the month before the test. Everything stops, we get ready for the test, because we teach to the test. It was funny, I was in Boston this morning, and a lady, who's retired teacher, came up to me and said, do you remember when we first started, it was considered unethical to teach to the test? Oh, yes, it was. You were supposed to teach the material. It was actually considered unethical. When the standards were being developed, people started to ask questions, and they started to wonder if this was a good idea. William McCallum, who was one of those 29 folks on the work groups, actually attended the National Association for Math Educators, and he brought them a draft copy of the standards, and they hated them. They said they're poorly written, they're obtuse, they're too hard in the early grades, and why are we in such a hurry? And he said, well, the feds are using Race to the Top money to get states to adopt the standards sight unseen, as we see. But don't worry, because these standards won't be too high. Certainly not in comparison with other nations where math education excels. The College Board, Senior Vice President Trevor Packer, addressed the American Association of School Superintendents, and he told them calculus sits outside the Common Core standards because Common Core slows the math progression down, so they won't get to calculus. The National Center for Education and the Economy, they're a federal think tank. Now, if you have followed this debate at all, you've probably heard of a man named Mark Tucker. Mark Tucker was actually involved in the 80s. In 1992, he wrote a letter to Hillary Clinton upon the election of her husband. It was read into the Congressional Record. It was a very famous letter, talking about changing education in America and how we need to get rid of local control and set the standards. At the time that Mark Tucker wrote that Dear Hillary letter, he was the president of the National Center for Education and the Economy, and he remains the president today. At the time he wrote the letter, the executive director of NCEE was a man named Michael Cohen, who is now the president of Achieve, the people who develop the Common Core state standards. So it's the same folks moving forward. So the National Center actually came out with a document in May of 2013 saying, what does it mean to be college and work ready? It means being ready to go to a community college. Middle school math, Algebra 1 by the end of your sophomore year in high school. Because they said you don't need, since most community colleges start with Algebra 1, you don't need to take Algebra 2 in high school to go to college and take Algebra 1. And since most of the careers out there don't require anything more than Algebra 2, it's kind of a waste to teach it. He compared it to teaching Latin. He did admit that the standards were very low. So is that a good idea? Should we move Algebra 1 to the end of our sophomore year in high school because that's all that our children need? You know, the U.S. will, to continue, this is the PARCC assessments. They say they're based on a model curriculum content. So I looked up the model curriculum content. What does PARCC teach since you're a member. And PARCC says to be able to add and subtract using the algorithm, write the problem down and solve it, 4th grade. Pre-Common Core, that's 2nd grade. Long division, 6th grade. Pre-Common Core, that's 4th grade. Except starting in 6th grade, you can use a calculator when you take the PARCC math test, so you don't really have to ever learn to do it at all, because you can use a calculator while you take the test. Is that a good idea? The U.S. Department of Education actually does study education. They do studies all the time. In 1999, they did a large study looking at what in high school leads to success in college. The document was called Answers in the Toolbox, and what they found was that math is important. And that if a child gets past Algebra 2 in high school, they more than double their odds of getting a bachelor's degree in college, in any major. But if Algebra 1 is in your sophomore year, that puts geometry in your junior year and Algebra 2 in your senior year, so you wouldn't get past Algebra 2 in this system. This Department of Education study became part of an Auburn University meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is where researchers, instead of doing a study, they go out and read all the studies that were done in a particular area to see if there's trends or patterns or things that they can find that match. Usually they look at 10 years. This group looked at 25 years worth of research, which is a really huge meta. And what they found was the secondary math rose, the likelihood of college degree attainment followed it, and the kids who got to calculus in high school were 28 times, I didn't say percent. I said times. That's 2,800%. More likely not just to finish a bachelor's degree, but to be a high achiever in college, regardless of their race, their socioeconomic status, the high school they went to, or the major that they took. Because the skills of higher math translate. Think in a straight line. Take a big problem, break it down into parts. Be disciplined in the way that you do it. Don't panic. Develop problem-solving skills. Well, those skills translate. Now, does that mean every child should take calculus? Of course not. Does that mean every child should go to college? Of course not. But it does mean that we should be setting policies in our secondary schools that are designed to give as many of our children as possible the opportunity to get as far ahead in math as they can. Because math opens doors and Common Core closes them. Because they'll never get here. How is it that the U.S. Department of Education doesn't know in 2015 what it did know in 1999? In English and Language Arts, the way that we teach now is called a close reading of the text, and you're only supposed to look at the text. This is a training that was given, I first got it in New York, but then I attended a bunch of training sessions in Pennsylvania, and it was handed to me as well. It's the Gettysburg Address, and what you're told is you're not supposed to talk about anything that's outside of the language of the Gettysburg Address. So you're not supposed to ask the children why were the North and the South fighting. You're not supposed to ask them if they've been to a funeral. You're not supposed to ask them if equality is worth fighting for. You're only supposed to talk about what Lincoln said, which is sort of ironic, because in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln says, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And this is exactly backwards from that. This is a 12th grade, and I actually have it. It's mine. My name's not Calvin. I bought it online, so it was used. 12th grade Common Core literature book. I picked it because it's Pearson, and Pearson is the largest publisher. They've now partnered with Microsoft, so they're the largest publisher of Common Core materials. They're actually the company that's developing the PARCC tests. So if you want to know what's happening in Common Core, you should look at Pearson. So this is their 12th grade book, and you're looking at the same cover. I just took a picture of it. It's their 12th grade literature book, and what we hear is this is so much more rigorous. So the very first thing on the very first page of the children's book that we tell these teenagers is that every selection in this book is available in audio format, and there's an audio summary as well. So there's an auditory cliff notes. So the first thing we tell these children is you don't have to read a word of the book. Now I was in Tennessee, and a teacher went, well, no teacher would tell the kids, would be like recommending that the kids do this. And I looked at her and said, have you ever been in a room with 30, 17-year-olds? As soon as you tell them they don't have to read, yeah. Are you kidding me? Especially the boys. I mean, they'll be like running. to the Cliff Notes. Now, truth be told, if you're honest, we all read the Cliff Notes, right? But what good teachers did, we did activities that you actually couldn't complete because I did want you to read Shakespeare. So I didn't care if you read the Cliff Notes first to get you started, but then you actually were going to read what Lady Macbeth said that day. But the publisher says, no, everything's available in audio. We'll give you the summary, so you don't have to read a single word here. So then I've actually read most of the book. This is just one example. This is Themes Across the Centuries. This is right out of the table of contents. Contemporary connections, how they talked about something in an earlier time and then how we did it in the 21st century. So this chapter is talking about Frankenstein. And first they read, Elizabeth McCracken is one of the editors of the book. So she begins by telling how she felt when she read Frankenstein. And then Mary Shelley, who is the author of Frankenstein, she writes about how she felt while she was writing Frankenstein. And then they read a Saturday Night Live skit called The Curse of Frankenstein. Did you notice what they didn't read? They didn't read Frankenstein. They actually never read the book, or even an excerpt from it. So how can you make an analysis of how the story of Frankenstein was carried forward into the 21st century if you didn't read the story? This is poor pedagogy at its finest. And sadly, it's not the only example in the book. And yet this is what we're handing 12th graders. So they're not actually reading the classics. This is an absolutely upside down and backwards way to teach. And when they get to the PARCC test, in the writing, they can use a word processor with a spell checker to write their answers. Now I'm going to take a little bit of time and just talk about this PARCC test, because I know it's an area of great concern. When I was in grad school, you know when you're a grad assistant, you're a slave. You do whatever the university tells you to do. So as part of my duties, I was the grad assistant who had to work in the psychometric testing clinic at the university where I worked. So I administered the tests, and scored the tests, and evaluated the tests, and used them to diagnose and then place children in IEPs. So I wound up learning a lot about psychometric testing. We hear that these tests are valid and reliable. And we are using these tests to determine the placement of children, whether they move forward or they go into remediation, whether they are promoted, whether they graduate, depending on where you are in the country, and how teachers are evaluated. And in some places, teachers are told your whole evaluation, and in some places what we hear is, well, only a certain percentage of your evaluation is based on the test, but if you don't get a positive, if the kids don't pass the test, that's the negative checkoff. Like, you can't even get to the next percentage unless they pass the test. So the test is what's called a high-stakes assessment. On their face, high-stakes assessments cannot be valid. And the reason they can't be valid is you can't control what the children bring to the testing situation. Perhaps that child has an undiagnosed illness. You know, one of my sisters, when we were kids, flunked all of her midterm exams. She was like in second grade, and the principal called my mother and said, I thought she was doing so well, I don't know what happened. You better come in, we better talk about it. And then my mother said, okay, and we're going to see each other in 2 days. And the next morning, my mother called back and laughing and said, never mind, she broke out in the measles last night. Because, you know, I come before the measles vaccine, so we actually got them. So she was sick when she took, but the rash hadn't happened yet. And the principal laughed and said, okay, well, we'll just rip those up. Because obviously they're meaningless. She was sick that day. Doesn't matter. So maybe the child was sick. Maybe there was an upheaval. You know, there's a divorce, their dog died last night, their sibling went off to college, which is a happy thing, but if you're the little one left at home, it can be traumatic. Maybe they didn't get breakfast or dinner. Maybe there was an upheaval in the neighborhood, you know, with police cars and fire engines. And the hotel I was in this morning, I guess somebody pulled the fire alarm, and so at like 9:30, we were all running out of the hotel because the alarm is ringing. Well, if that had happened at 4 in the morning, I really wouldn't have been good at taking a test the next day. In any given big testing population, like a state, about 10%, research varies a little bit, but about 10% of the kids will have one of those factors. So instead of really testing how well you could do math, without knowing it, I'm measuring that your dog died last night. And that's really what you're telling me. Except I don't know which children they are, and neither does anybody else. But what we do know is as the socioeconomic level of the child goes down, that percentage goes up. Because children who live in poverty are more likely to have an undiagnosed illness, and more likely to have had upheaval in their home, and to have not had good nutrition or good rest the night before. It is not a coincidence that if you take the test results and you put them beside the economic levels of schools and school districts, the lines are parallel. But yet we're taking these kids and saying, okay, you have to go into remediation, which means we're slowing their progress down even more. So problem number one is you can't control what the child brings to the testing situation. Problem number two, to be valid, the test has to say what, if this is the thing that I'm measuring, then I'm not measuring anything else. So if it's a multiplication test, you wouldn't expect me to say spell the word cat in the test, because now it's not a multiplication test. But these tests have what are called constructive response assessments. So it's a math test. But they don't just have to solve the problem. They have to solve the problem, and then they have to write about why did you solve the problem the way that you solved it. Well, now it's not a math test. It's a writing test. Well, who does that affect? Well, if you ask little girls to write an essay telling you why did you do what you do, they'll begin by telling you what they had for breakfast that morning and how it affected what they did in this thing. And they're wearing their pretty pink bow, and they'll put little hearts over it, and they'll fill the front page and the back page, and it'll be longer than you want. If you ask a little boy, especially a little boy who's good in math, why did you do the math the way you did it? He's going to write, because that's the way it worked. And what he won't write, but will be thinking is, you dummy. Yeah. What are you asking me for? I solved it. So what it's doing is it's pulling boys' scores down. Who else does it affect? ESL or ELL, depending on what you call it. English as a second language students, who maybe understood the math, but standard English is way out of their league. Learning disabled kids. Learning disabilities are really an odd thing. Some kids are disabled across the spectrum, but not most. Most kids who have that particular exceptionality are numerically challenged or they're linguistically challenged. Meaning I can do numbers, but I can't do language. I can do language, but I can't do numbers. So if you have an LD kid who's really good at math, but has a linguistic issue, you're going to give them a lower math score. And nobody will know that it wasn't that they couldn't, that they didn't write about it well. They're going to get put in math remediation. And who else? Kids from lower socioeconomic status, because they don't have standard English in the home. They are typically less able to sit through the big long testing situation. They get more frustrated more easily because they have so many other issues. And so they solve the math and they're really frustrated. It's like, I'm just not writing this. I'm done with you. Like, that's enough. They'll get a lower score too. What's the result of that? So let's start with, we know success in college, getting to calculus in high school, leads to greater success in college. The Common Core slows the math progression down, and as you saw, if Algebra 1 is in your sophomore year, and we know that it should be in 8th grade, how many years is that? 2. So back off 2 steps for the average kid. We're already 2 steps back. Now we take kids who are in these math assessments, who are being graded actually on writing instead of math, so they're going to get a lower math score, so we're putting them in math remediation, so they're slowed down even more. And since we know that kids from lower SES backgrounds, socioeconomic status backgrounds, will have a higher percentage of that, the effect will be that the achievement gap will get wider. These kids are slowed down even more. So the first problem is that we're slowing down their progression. The second problem, now we're putting them in math remediation. Where did the time come from? You know, there's still only 24 hours in the day. They still spend this much time in school. So we have to take the time from something else. So we take it from art, or music, or computers, or an extra literature course, or an extra language. So the children who are least likely to have enrichment opportunities in their outside lives are going to be deprived of them in school as well, put into remediation that they may or may not need. So that's the second effect. Third effect, teacher evaluation is tied to the results of the assessments, which means teachers who teach in poor schools will be pushed out first, because their children won't do as well for all the reasons we just talked about. So those kids will get lower scores, so their teachers will get lower evaluations, so we will lose the experienced teachers. Who do we replace them with? Well, in many inner cities, they're being replaced with what are called Teach for America volunteers, who have 5 weeks of training and are told if they can stick it out for 2 years, they can have a college loan forgiven or get help with another thing that they want. 5 weeks does not a teacher make, especially in that population. Or they get the most junior teachers, inexperienced teachers just out of college, who walk into that kind of environment and go, okay, I don't even know what to do with this. But because we didn't deal with any of the underlying problems, those teachers won't pass the assessments either, which means that children in the poorest districts will have revolving door teachers. They will always have the most inexperienced teachers in front of them. So the kids who most need experience are the least likely to get it, which perpetuates the cycle in 3 different areas. These tests are discriminatory. There's no excuse for this. And there's no way that the people promulgating it didn't know it, because it's all based on research that is commonly known. Now let's move to the next problem. Okay, so tests are valid. They test what they say they're going to test. Reliable. Reliable means I can trust the answer. Now, it's the same every time. You can be reliable and not valid. For example, every morning I get on my bathroom scale. I love my bathroom scale. It says I weigh 110 pounds. This is a wonderful bathroom scale. It's terrific. And then I need my physical, and I go to the doctor, and I have to stand on his scale. And it doesn't say 110. My bathroom scale was reliable. It said 110 every day, but it wasn't valid because the number wasn't right. So you can be one without the other, or you can be neither. So when we look at these assessments, and let's look at the writing, for example. So the kids have to write, and if you go online, you can actually, there's a 4th grade PARCC practice test that you can take. And as you read through it, a couple of things begin to surface. The first is, this is a test, and we're asking 4th graders to take it, and they have to type their answers, except 4th graders can't type. So while they're trying to hold their answer in their head, they're hunting and pecking in a test that's timed with technology that may or may not work the way it's supposed to. And the way the test is set up to guard from cheating, if they happen to click, you know how with the mouse you can click? Because it's you can only see what's on the computer screen at any given time. So you read the story and then you get to the questions, and then you have to find the sentence that matches your answer. So they have to scroll back through all those screens to try to find it. So they're clicking as fast as they can. But if they happen to click outside what is the test box, it freezes and won't let them go on in the test. They're 9! You're adults. Have you ever mistakenly clicked something you didn't really want to click? Yes. And yet the whole test freezes if they happen to click outside the box. Can you imagine the stress level for a 9-year-old? And you want them to do anything constructive? So they get this essay written. And now we send it out to graders. Where did the graders come from? They're seasonal workers. They get a couple of weeks of training. They don't have to have a degree in education. So they're not teachers. They can have a degree in basket weaving. And they're given a rubric. If it sort of looks like this, it gets this many points. I used to judge forensics, debate competitions and public speaking competitions. You could get 7 points. Now, if you've ever judged junior high forensics and listened to junior high speakers, some of them are really quite good. But some of them begin their presentation, and as they get to the end of every sentence, you lose the last words. And then they start the next sentence, but then you lose the words at the end. And then they start again, but then you lose the words at the end. And so I would grade down for that. And then give them exercises that would keep them from losing the end of every sentence. And then you get speakers who, and you're practically seasick by the time that they're done, because they're so nervous that they do their whole presentation like this. And I would grade down for that, and then give them exercises. This is how you fix it, because it was supposed to be an educational experience as well as a competition. There are always 2 graders in each of these competition rooms as they went through all the rounds. And in one of the years, I looked over, and my partner gave every single kid 7 points on everything. You know it's a competition, right? Like, they win. There's prizes here. There's scholarship awards. It's a competition. And she said, well, they're such lovely children. I just think they should all get all the points for everything. Okay. So here you have these unknown scoring people who have 2 weeks of training and are not teachers, and they are reading these papers and deciding how many points based on it demonstrates a thorough understanding or a good understanding. Can you explain the difference between those 2 terms in a way that is qualitatively accurate? No. And do you have any way of knowing if the person who read your child's paper was Miss Mary Martinette over here, or my partner, Lucy Goosey, who said everybody should get all the points for everything because the darling children, or me who said, no, I want you to learn something. Or if it's at the beginning of the day or the end of the day. I've graded hundreds of essays. Trust me, the people who got graded first didn't get treated the same as the people who got graded last, and if I had a glass of wine during the day, boy, those people were very lucky. But in a regular class with real teachers, the child can walk up and say, what were you thinking? Well, they never did if they got a higher grade, of course. But if they got a lower grade, they could say, what were you thinking? But in this system, you don't even know who graded that paper. And you don't know if the other person who graded it would get the same score. So it's not reliable, and it's not valid. I was in Tennessee, and one of the folks on the committee was a surgeon. And he had just taken his, surgeons have to be recertified every so many years, so that they know all the technology, and this is all good. And he had just taken his exam, and I said to him, and how many of the questions on your exam were essay? And he said, well, none. Right. Because by definition, when it is a subjective evaluation, it cannot be valid or reliable, which is why licensing doesn't come that way. But yet, we're basing children's promotion and graduation and teacher evaluation on a test that is none of those things. That is none of those things. If this were medicine, we would call it malpractice. The SAT, Mr. Coleman moved from the Common Core to the SAT, and he has made it Common Core compliant. So now we've eliminated the essay section, we've eliminated a bunch of the vocabulary, and we've taken out whole sections of the math, because when we dumb the math down, if the SAT was still testing trig, when we don't teach it, scores would go down and parents would ask questions. So again, this is not raising the bar, it's lowering the definition of success so that people will still see high scores. Now he's like to end with good news. This is my granddaughter? Well, why am I showing her to you? Because one, she's adorable. But two, you have a face just like that in your life. That when you see it, it makes your heart sing. In the state of Pennsylvania, the Department of Education testified in front of our House Education Committee in behalf of Common Core. And when they talked about it and talked about the schools coming out with products, they actually called the children widgets. And they went on to say, and it was in newspapers at the time, that, for example, if you go to a McDonald's in City A and you buy a hamburger, and then you go to the McDonald's in City B and buy a hamburger,